Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana. I am a volunteer on the Philly SHRM Programming Committee. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled Strategies for Creating Effective Sensitivity Training to Address Harassment, Discrimination, and to Promote a Safe Workplace. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them via the question box of the GoToWebinar panel, and we will read them aloud to the speaker at the end of the webinar. We also want to remind you that you are eligible to receive one HR General HRCI credit and one SHRM Professional Development credit for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with a survey link. The survey must be completed for you to receive the certificate for your credits. Once the survey has been completed, the credit forms will be emailed to you within 1 week. All slides will be sent to all attendees after the webinar. Today's webinar will feature Deirdre Gronin, Vice President of Human Resources and General Counsel for Innovative Benefit Planning, LLC. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. This is Deirdre Gronin, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation. I have a little disclaimer. I have a little cough, so forgive me if you hear that throughout the presentation, just poor timing. But I'm here today to talk to you about, I'm going to share some of my prior experiences, as well as talk about, obviously, developing, harassment and discrimination training for your businesses. And just a little backup, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm an attorney, and I graduated from law school in 2004. And I was a litigator for about 7 years, and I was doing employment law before I went in-house. And then when I went in-house, I worked for a company in 2011 as their VP of HR and General Counsel. And when I started, there were about 800 employees. And when I left there in 2018, there were about 2,400. So I saw a lot of growth, a lot of change, a lot of great things. And one big aspect of my experience there was helping to promote and develop and implement diversity and inclusion strategy, harassment training, sensitivity training. And along the way, I learned a lot that I wanted to share. And I think, my why in presenting this, I know we have a few people on the line who attended the Philly SHRM Symposium pre-conference, and I shared my why. But, as an HR professional, I feel that, HR is very busy, right? And we wear a lot of different hats. And things like diversity and inclusion, harassment training, sensitivity training are really, in my opinion, some of the most important things that we need to tackle. But if you're tasked with that, you're also likely, as an HR professional, tasked with many other things. So along the way, I feel that there are things I could have done differently. I certainly made mistakes along the way, and I learned a lot of things along the way. And, I'm here today, and I did the pre-conference too, to impart some of that knowledge that I learned to hopefully help you in developing your strategies and developing your training. And there are things, honestly, that I wish I knew, back then. And I'm hoping you'll get a lot out of today's session. So, when I left the prior place, I'm now with Innovative Benefit Planning, and we do benefits consulting, we do wellness consulting, we do retirement plan services, and we do HR consulting. So, part of my job and what I'm doing for our clients is helping them develop training, implement training, as well as handbooks and HR and compliance questions, things of that nature. So, without further ado, I'll kick it off and talk to you about today's agenda. So, again, I know there are a few people who are at the pre-conference, but I do think it's really important. I think we have about 30 people on the line, and many of whom did not attend. Some of these, I'm going to go through some of the important definitions and concepts around diversity and inclusion, sensitivity, et cetera. Because, again, I think these are some things that I didn't necessarily know, and I think would have really helped in trying to implement some of these strategies and initiatives. And then we'll talk about diversity and inclusion and, those initiatives and some of those definitions. And then we'll finish up with talking about manager and employee training and some best practices and strategies to get the most out of your training with your managers and your employees. Okay. So starting off, we're going to talk about these definitions and concepts, and this is a list of what we'll talk about. We have further slides, but unconscious bias, microaggression, intersectionality, structural racism and sexism versus discrimination, privilege, and white supremacy. So certainly very important topics. So starting with unconscious bias, this is, if you haven't heard about it, but it's essentially social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. Their unconscious beliefs about various social and identity groups. And, these are things that exist in all of us. They have to do with, where you grew up, how you grew up, messages that you're receiving that are really outside your unconsciousness through social structures, through, education, things of that nature. And, what's important to understand about unconscious bias is, having that kind of bias. I think a lot of people, if you think about, bias, automatically they might turn to, okay, well, if you're calling me out on my bias, I'm not a racist person, I'm not a sexist person, I'm not a homophobic person, etc. But getting past that, with you're talking about unconscious bias and saying, it's something that exists in all of us, and if we don't talk about it and we don't get it out in the open, we're not going to break through some of these barriers to make sure that, particularly in the workspace, that we have a diverse, inclusive, safe, and open environment in the workplace. And ways that it can impact on the workplace, certainly with hiring. So if your hiring managers have unconscious bias, and it affects how they're hiring and who they're hiring. Certainly with mentoring, so the individuals that they spend more time with, and certainly with people that they promote. And a good example is the studies show that people often in their social groups, they might gravitate towards people that look like them, and it's not just who look like them, but also maybe who are in the same, let's say, social categories. When you're hiring, it might be something as simple as what college did you go to, what sporting team did you participate in, did you do a sorority, were you in a fraternity, etc. But all these things about how as individuals we have existed in the world, and who and who we are as people could impact, us gravitating towards people that are like us. And if we don't tackle that and address it, it's going to filter its way into hiring, mentoring, and then also the people that we're spending time with, and perhaps the people that we're recommending for promotions. And, one thing I mentioned later with managers is that there's this concept of informal mentoring. And if managers are spending time with people in the office, and those people they gravitate to are people that look like them, then some of those people might be getting some informal mentoring that will take them from one level to the next and provide more success in the business. But if you can tackle that and address it with your managers and make sure they understand where their biases could be, and also, addressing that if they're going to be mentoring, either formal or informal, meaning, taking them out to dinner, doing social activities with them, that they have mindfulness about the people that they're spending time with, and they're not creating an environment where people feel that there are favorites, and maybe those favorites sometimes, unfortunately, maybe go along gender lines, race lines, etc. So up here I have just a note about orchestra auditions, which demonstrates the concept of unconscious bias. But in the 70s and 80s, orchestras, across the nation started to develop these blind auditions. And the concept was that the representation of women in the orchestra was about 6%. And they originally, they were open auditions so that people could see gender, race, etc. And originally started with auditions where the people who were judging couldn't see the people, and they were behind a screen. But it didn't have a big impact, because what they figured out was that many of the people that were judging, if the women were wearing heels, they could still hear the clack of the heels, and that was enough to put some unconscious bias or bias in their minds. And ultimately, they decided to, when they were doing these orchestra auditions, to have everyone go barefoot. And once they changed that strategy, they ended up increasing women in the orchestra being selected by 30%. So that's just one example of ways that unconscious bias can affect, selection, and also a way that, we can try to combat that. We'll talk a little bit later about artificial intelligence and ways that you can maybe put that into your recruiting strategy. All right, so just some stats. What happens when unconscious bias goes unchecked? Who leads our companies? So the Fortune 500 CEOs, 95% are male, 95% are white. The average height is 6'2", right? So in the U.S., men comprise 49% of the total population. About 4% of adult men are 6'2" or taller. So we're talking about a very small segment of our population are leading some of our top companies in the country. So this is, one of the many reasons why it's really important that we're talking about these issues, so we can try to break more barriers and, change the makeup of corporate America as well as other areas, of the workforce. All right, and just, some takeaways. I read a really good book called Blind Spot, which we actually had some of our employees read as well, some of our leaders, which I really enjoyed. And in that book actually is this test that everyone could take. And I think, a takeaway is we all have bias. And in order to try to combat that, we need to actually actively and consciously check ourselves against our biases. So I think everyone's going to get a copy of the PowerPoint after. So I would really encourage you to take this test. And, you might be very surprised by the results and evaluating your own biases. All right, so next is microaggressions. And this is one that when I was at my prior place of employment, we had a diversity and inclusion summit. And in that summit, we did breakouts. And, people shared with me that microaggressions were something that, they were dealing with almost daily in their everyday lives, not necessarily daily at the place of employment, but that they had experienced it at the place of employment as well as elsewhere. And, certainly we have examples in our workforce as well as in general, society where people are practicing and showing overt signs of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. But I think, these days, particularly in the workplace, perhaps it's more not as obvious, right? And there are more subtle ways that people are being subjected to, racism, discrimination, harassment, etc. So microaggressions was one that, I didn't really know a whole lot about. And I felt it was really important to know as an HR professional. So these are brief and commonplace daily verbal or behavioral indignities directed at marginalized groups. And I have some examples on the following slides, but I included this link. This is a really good BuzzFeed article, and I in the next slides I'll show you a couple examples in picture that are in this article, but I think they really demonstrate what these microaggressions can look like. So this is one example, a young woman who, because she's, Asian American and doesn't fit some mold of, perhaps a white individual, she's questioned often, hey, where are you from? Which is, maybe a normal topic of conversation. And when she says, I'm from New York, they say, no, where are you really from? And, sometimes the important thing to know about microaggressions is they could be unintentional. They're not, sometimes people, you're curious, you want to know something about somebody, and sometimes they're more intentional and kind of undercutting. But this is one example. And if you were someone who you were asked this question, every day, all the time, it stops being just a polite question and ends up making you feel like an outsider and that somehow you're different or you're other. Okay, so that's one example. And this is someone who is biracial and is asked the question, what are you? And the answer is human, right? Being biracial doesn't make her a what. And then these are just some examples of racial microaggressions. A white man or woman clutches their purse or checks their wallet as a Black or Latino man approaches or passes them. Hidden message, you and your group are criminals. An Asian American born and raised in the United States is complimented for speaking good English. Hidden message, you're not a true American, you're a perpetual foreigner in your own country. Thirdly, people touching a person of color's hair without permission or asking to touch their hair. And it's speaking to people, this is something that happens constantly. And it's objectifying and disrespectful to the person's agency over their own body, and it reinforces otherness. And then gender microaggressions, one that's not on here is often, the studies show that women are interrupted, much more than men in meetings. So that's one example. But An assertive female manager is labeled as a bitch, while her male counterpart is described as a forceful leader. Hidden message: women should be passive and allow men to be the decision makers. A female physician wearing a stethoscope is mistaken as a nurse. Women should occupy nurturing and not decision-making roles. Women are less capable than men. And that's not to say that nurses are not super important in the environment, but another good example is I had a friend who was an attorney who was in a suit, had a rolling suitcase because she had all her files. She went to a deposition, which is a legal proceeding, and one of the male attorneys asked her if she was the court reporter. Another example of making assumptions about women, which are untrue and unfair. Whistles or catcalls are heard from men as a woman walks down the street. Hidden message there: your body or appearance is for the enjoyment of men, and you are a sex object. And again, all these microaggressions, if these are things that are happening to people of color or women on a pretty constant basis, and you can imagine how that can really affect someone either in the workplace or outside of the workplace. Lastly, other examples: as a young person for sexual orientation, a young person uses the term gay to describe a movie that she didn't like. Hidden message: being gay is associated with negative and undesirable characteristics. A man reveals he is gay and someone responds, "You're gay? What do you mean? You don't seem gay." Hidden message: stereotype that all gay people are the same. Lastly, two gay men hold hands in public and are told not to flaunt their sexuality. Hidden message: same-sex displays of affection are abnormal and offensive. Keep it private and to yourself. So, these are just some examples of microaggressions, and these are things that can be happening in the workplace. I had a friend, a coworker, who was in the workplace, African American, and the lights. She came in the morning. Sometimes people didn't turn the lights up right away, and people came in, and someone who was in leadership said, "Oh, look, you can't even see her because the lights were out." And she carried that with her for many years. So, thinking about how you're speaking to people, how you're holding your employees accountable, and what the expectations are. And these are just important to know because it's not just people using, offensive language such as, racial slurs or sexist slurs or, homophobic slurs or religious slurs, etc. But these, daily slights that could happen that could really have an impact in your workplace and on your employees. So the next concept I wanted to talk about was intersectionality. And this is the concept that if someone is, their identity is based not just on one aspect of their identity. So, I am a white female, and in my lifetime I may have faced oppression or discrimination based on my gender. Well, an African American female has, is more compounded because she may have been facing, both gender discrimination as well as discrimination based on her race. And, someone who is a lesbian, that it's even compounded further. So the important thing to take away from intersectionality is when you're dealing with diversity and inclusion and developing strategies, that you make sure that you're not talking about just one thing. And for example, we had years ago a women's summit, and we weren't talking about intersectionality. And so we were talking about gender. And the problem is that, in doing so, we were limiting, our discussions and what we could have taken away from some of those conversations if we had been more intersectional and talking about all the aspects of, a person's identity and how that makes up their experience, both in the world and in the workplace. All right, and then structural racism and sexism versus discrimination. So I thought this is an important concept because, certain people can face discrimination, of course, which is typically an individual experience. A white man could go into a store that was owned by a person of color, and they could be turned away, and that they could be facing discrimination based on their race. But the difference is with that is, that white male is not going to be facing the kind of structural racism or sexism that exists in our society. So understanding the difference is really, understanding that there are structural practices in place that have a global impact on people and their experience in the world. And some of, historical examples, of course, are, slavery, Jim Crow laws, segregation, and, the right to vote for, women and people of color. And presently some structural barriers with respect to education and, loans and financial stuff and things of that nature that still exist today. So I think it's just important to differentiate between the two and when you're talking about, harassment, discrimination, diversity, and inclusion. All right. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about privilege. I think, it's certainly something that came up in my conversation through, the diversity inclusion committee and the conference and the summit. And, obviously it's for privilege. I just think a really good example that's, in the news today is privilege can be socioeconomic, can be based on gender, race, being able-bodied, being heterosexual, things of that nature. And, an example we're seeing today is with this controversy with, people paying money to get their children into college and using their wealth to the disadvantage of others to, try to raise up their own children and get them something that doesn't appear that they deserve. So, I think it's important to also talk about white privilege. This is just one example, but I read a really good article, and it's in the Tolerance magazine by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's called "What is White Privilege Really?" So if anyone's interested in learning more about that topic, I think it's a really good read, and it really breaks it down. But, the concept of white privilege, I spoke at a diversity conference last year, and we were talking about white privilege, and one of the individuals said, I don't, that concept doesn't make sense to me. I've worked for everything I have. Nothing's been handed to me. And I think what's important with this concept is it's not a question of that you haven't earned or deserve everything you have, as a white person. It's that people of color have, or, and women in cases have barriers that even if you put two people in the same and they're on the same level playing field, that they're going to face barriers that people that are not in those protected classes don't face. So it's not about, placing any blame. It's more about collectively understanding it and coming together to try to remove some of those barriers that exist, structurally throughout the United States and other parts of the world for sure. And then white supremacy, I think, most of us know what white supremacy is in the sense of, we see those people with, the Ku Klux Klan and those groups that are more on the outskirts, if you will. But the concept of white supremacy culture is that our culture doesn't mean that we're all white supremacists if we are white. It means that, the norms and the, expectations for people are based around, a white history or a white culture, which is in and of itself, of course, alienating and oppressive to people that don't fit into that mold. So, I think a concept for HR professionals, the idea of white privilege, I mean, it's a topic that I think you need to get to when you're talking about diversity and inclusion and educate people on. It's probably not what you start with. You need to kind of break down barriers, get people outside their comfort zone and work on it. But I think for any HR professional, it's something that we need to be thinking about and talking about and understanding. So. All right, so moving on. What is diversity and inclusion and why is it important? So, diversity is pretty straightforward, right? It's looking at who do you have in your organization, right? It's who makes up and you want to look across all departments, entry level, any department, as well as who's in your leadership, all the way up to the C-suite. But, inclusion is about once you have people there, are you actually making them feel heard and recognized for their unique attributes and having an environment where they feel safe and open to be themselves for who they are and for their differences. And, the importance of both existing together is that, if you check a box, if you will, and I think there are a lot of businesses out there that, everyone's talking about diversity and inclusion and they're working to get more diversity in their organizations. But, some people, maybe it's for optics or to check a box. And if you're doing it for that reason and you're not putting things in place to the employee base, then it's not going to work and people aren't going to stay. And if people feel like they come in and they're not part of the business, then they're going to leave. And it's going to lead to high turnover, certainly low morale, and lower productivity. So just some, studies on this, but diversity teams outperform non-diverse teams. So diverse thinkers are markedly better at solving problems than teams selected for their team's intellectual ability. And these are, some concepts you want to bring to your leadership when you're talking about, and the profitability of diversity could probably be a whole nother hour, but, diversity inclusion is not just about feel good and having a great environment, which to me is a very important part of it, but also talking about the fact that if you have diversity and diversity of thought and experience, etc., you're going to have more ideas and experiences to draw from, and it's going to make things, your, procedures, your environment, your ideas and your strategies that much better. So I think it's something you want to be talking to your leaders about, when you're trying to promote diversity and inclusion. And, when I did the pre-conference, I had another person on the panel with me, and he made a good point of not only do you have to have diversity on your staff in order to be successful, but you want to make sure that people on staff feel empowered to speak up, and that it's not, a majority or a certain group of people who have a voice at the table. So if you have, 10 people at a table and you have diversity at that table, but the people that, the women, people of color do not feel empowered to speak up, then you really have the diversity without the inclusion and without the positive impact. And then non-diverse teams suffer from groupthink. So teams with members from diverse backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives avoid groupthink, where homogeneous teams approach problems from the same angle. All right, so where do we start with a diversity inclusion initiative? So I think the most important thing is leadership buy-in, right? So you need to make sure from the top down that your leaders understand the importance of it and are committed to being involved and spreading the message to the rest of the employees. Secondly, really important is training and resources for the HR professional. And I've already met, many people who often they are tasked with, they're already a very busy HR professional. They care about diversity, inclusion, harassment, discrimination, and developing programs. And they're asked to be the diversity and inclusion person, which is probably, they already don't have enough time to do everything else that they're doing. So, I think an important takeaway here is that if you are that person or there's someone on your team that is that person, that it's really important to give them training. There are seminars, there are diversity and inclusion certificates. I'm a member of the Pennsylvania Diversity Council, and we get together quarterly, and I meet a lot of other HR professionals, and it's just a really good forum for discussion. But if you're really thinking about, or even if you're 2 years down the pike and you haven't seen a lot of success, hiring a consultant, getting someone in there that can talk to you about some of these things that even I talked to you about today already, that, that even if you care about these issues that you don't necessarily know. I mean, it takes some education being a student. And honestly, even if you have all the best intentions, you might have 50 other fires you have to put out. So, advocating for getting the proper training, getting a consultant in, and really understanding all the issues that surround diversity, inclusion, harassment, and discrimination, so you can really create the best programs and be the best resource for your employees. And then also, I think, having a diversity and inclusion committee. And, we started that at my last place, and, drawing in people from all different departments, different levels. So you don't want to have all managers. You also don't want to have, all non-managers, really getting a diverse group of people so that you have the right voices in the room to help develop your programs. All right, and then review your recruiting and hiring. So for, purposes of, discrimination, harassment, diversity, etc., you want to look at what your recruiting practices look like. And if you're getting the right people in the door, and then once you're getting them in the door for an interview, what's it look like, as far as people that you're actually hiring? And, often your applicant tracking systems, it's going to be optional, but you can track, what the diversity is of your, your people that are applying, as well as the people that you're bringing in for interviews, as well as the people, obviously, once they're hired. If you do your EEO reports and your form, you can track that diversity. And think about where you're recruiting. Is there actual diversity? I mean, if you're going to career fairs, but the schools are 99% white, then you're not going to get access to people to create some diversity in your recruiting. And then lastly, referrals and word of mouth recruiting. You have to be careful here too. So, if you have a fairly homogeneous workplace as it stands, and you're relying primarily on referrals or word of mouth to get people in the door for interviews, again, with some of that unconscious bias or people that are in their world, you might end up with just promoting more homogeneity in your workplace. So you just have to be really careful. Probably, some diversity in your recruiting types, career fairs, online recruiting, et cetera, referrals would probably go a long way to promote more diversity. All right, and then blind selection of applicants versus, being colorblind or gender blind. And I just wanted to mention this because I'm sure we've heard people in our lifetime say, well, I don't see color, I don't see gender, I think to most people, that's, I guess, in some ways maybe a strong word, but offensive because, you should see people's the backgrounds and their experiences. What's their gender? What's their race? Their religion, etc. That makes up who they are as human beings, and it's important to understand people's differences and what their experiences have been. So, kind of differentiating that from blind selection of applicants. And there are different, and I won't promote any. I have seen a few, but there are ways. First of all, you can do unconscious bias training with your hiring managers. And then there are different technologies with artificial intelligence in recruiting where you can strip away things so that people aren't necessarily, just by looking at a resume, they can't tell gender, race, etc. And that's a way that you can try to eliminate unconscious bias from some of the selection. All right, and then next is interviewing. So train your recruiters and your hiring managers on interview questions, and this goes beyond, the harassment and discrimination piece, but, don't assume that they know the right questions to ask. I've been in interviews where people are asking about, hey, do you have kids? Or, how old are your kids? And I had to say, and there was a woman, and, that could be, unconscious bias there, or create an impression of bias, right? So if you're asking a woman, do you have kids or how old are your kids? Then there's this perception, oh, well, they think I'm the primary caretaker and that I'm not going to perform as well at work because of that. So don't assume that your employees or your managers or recruiters know what to ask. Scripting is always really good. Obviously, you don't want it to be robotic, but, people are just people, right? So they get into an interview room, they start having conversation, they get comfortable, and they feel that they're just trying to bond with someone. But unless you really train them on what are the right questions to ask and what questions to avoid, things about age and race and gender and kids and their family status, and I have a whole interviewing guidelines and training that I use and do, because it doesn't mean they're bad people. They just, unless they have the right training, and unless that training honestly is refreshed, they're going to get it wrong. So don't rely on people's just their goodwill or their, that they're good people. They need to be trained. Training them on unconscious bias for interviewing purposes, and also just making sure your recruiters and hiring managers understand the importance and benefits of diversity, as well as leadership's commitment to it. Knowing that, like, from the top down, this is something we care about. It goes a long way in changing people's mindsets, and knowing that if they're not also committing to it, that they're going to be held accountable. All right, so manager training. So, I've done manager training, I've done employee, training, and it's important for your managers certainly to train them on the legal definitions of harassment and discrimination. And, that is an important part. It's just one small part of it. They need to understand legally, what behavior could constitute harassment and discrimination. Also understanding that as a manager, and if they're the perpetrators, that the business could be held automatically liable. And also that as a manager, they have a responsibility to report any sort of harassing and discriminatory behavior, or otherwise inappropriate behavior. But one thing that we always did in our training is making sure that they understand, even if something's not legally harassment or legally, discrimination, and harassment has to be severe or pervasive, and maybe these are comments that are happening, once or twice, etc. We still can't accept it and we can't tolerate it. So that's why we have to move beyond those legal definitions, and make sure that the real goal is to make sure people feel included, that they feel safe, that they feel like they work in an environment where their managers and their leadership will not accept inappropriate behavior, and we're not just focusing on those illegal acts. And then, really training on how to handle reports of harassing, discriminatory behavior. And, I've done training with managers over the years, and, these can be really tough conversations or uncomfortable, for people. And I had a situation where, at my prior place of employment, we had a lot of people that were homegrown in the sense that they came in entry level and then they were promoted, and became, managers or even vice presidents, and they had, grown up per se in the business, and they had training, but they were, they needed help in really navigating these difficult situations. And example I had was I had an employee who we had salespeople, and they would go into the home to give an estimate, and he went to the house, they opened the door, and they turned him away. And he was African American, and he came back to his manager and he said, I feel like this is based on my race, and I feel really upset and I'm offended, whatever. And the manager was trying to just calm him down and said, oh, no, I don't think it was that. And the marketer who went to the door was also African American. And, and then this employee ended up calling me. And he just felt like the situation could have been handled differently. And in that case, it's, we've had the training with him, but they're not easy situations to deal with. And what I said to him is, the most important thing you can do for an employee to start is to be empathetic and to listen to them. And I'm not saying there's, a clear-cut approach for every situation, but the more you can train managers about that empathy and listening, and also calling you the HR person when situations pop up, that they can get advice from you and they're not in it alone. And I just think it's really important. And if we're not training them, then we're hurting them, and we're hurting the employees for sure. And making clear that managers have a responsibility to help the company's mission in diversity and inclusion and examine their own unconscious biases, have training sessions, have accountability, tracking their metrics, things like that. It's, really important. And we had a big push at my last place. It was, home remodeling, construction business, a lot of men, and the turnaround there as far as the people and the diversity in the staff has been astounding. And really putting the focus on it, and also letting the managers and the employees know how important it is to the business, I think has really taken it to the next level. And then, training and discussion on unconscious bias and distinguishing it from labels of racist, sexist, etc. And I alluded to this earlier. And I read this really good book, and it's by Robin DiAngelo, and it's called White Fragility. Why is it difficult for white people to talk about racism? And she's a white woman, and she's a diversity consultant. But these are tough topics for people. And the more honestly you talk about them, the easier it gets. And I've seen it with my own eyes that, starting maybe with your managers or starting with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee and talking about these difficult topics, it brings people out and makes it feel like it's safer to talk about those things. And, to give you an example, several years ago at my last place of employment, we had, I did an HR training, and we were talking about harassment, discrimination, a long list of things. And I had a young man who was working in Georgia, African American, and we had door-to-door marketers, and he called me because he just was worried about his safety. There was a lot of, he felt a lot of backlash with Black Lives Matter, and he felt unsafe. And I brought that up in the meeting, and I felt that the managers clammed up, right? And when the topic of race or sexism or any of these topics comes up, people feel uncomfortable. And take that fast forward several years later, in that same company, those same people are having all those tough conversations. And is it perfect? No, but it's by talking about it and pushing people outside their comfort zone, and making them also understand that when you're training your recruiters on bias, unconscious bias, or correcting people on behavior, or talking to them about how they could have said something or done something differently, that we're not calling them a racist, a sexist, etc. It's not about good versus evil. It's about recognizing that we all have biases and that we need to work together to try to overcome them, and that it's going to have a very positive impact on the workplace and in people's experience, with the company. All right, and then diversity, inclusion, and hiring, mentoring, promotions, and team building. And again, making sure managers understand leadership's commitment to diversity and inclusion and are held accountable. Promote inclusive events, not only just, male, female. It's like, think about, family events for people that have families. Don't always have happy hours. We used to, years ago we would do a lot of golf outings, which I'm not saying we can't play golf and that women also don't play golf, but is primarily a male sport. And so we ended up doing a kickball tournament, things like that. Just think about ways that you could make it feel more inclusive for all your employees will go a long way. And then I did allude to this earlier, but discuss informal mentoring and favoritism. And I, in my career, have had a couple calls where employees have said, I feel like there are favorites in the office and that this manager or this VP buddies up with, all this group of people. And at least one of them said, and it just so happens that all those people are of the same race or of the same gender. And by doing that, you're creating an environment where people feel excluded and certainly not an inclusive environment. And people want to see people like them in the business that look like them, that are thriving. And if you have VPs and managers who are spending more time with people that look like them and not promoting that diversity and inclusion, it can have a severe impact on the morale of the business, the office, the department, etc. All right, and then so let's move on to employee training engagement. So one, I think you always need to do it at new hire, right? So every new hire should go through sensitivity, harassment, and discrimination training. And I always call it sensitivity training because it's not just about harassment, discrimination. It's about creating an environment where people are sensitive to other people's differences and how their behavior impacts them, and holding them accountable. Best case scenario is the training's going to be live. Now, that's not always scalable, right? So, I've had office managers who were an extension of HR, and they would do live training with, all the new hires. And then I would do training with all the new VPs and all the new managers. And, your best case is it's live. But, a good idea could be that you could do, whether it's you as an HR professional or if you feel someone else is better suited. Back years ago, we had someone come from Dwayne Morris, so I have to give him some credit because he had a really great program, Michael Cohen, and he came in and did a sensitivity training with our employees, and we ended up videotaping it, and then we would use it for all the new hires and for some ongoing training. So if you're at a larger place or you have a place that has multiple locations, where I was at, there were 14 offices. So unless you feel like, you can have your HR person do that training every time, which is certainly ideal, or do that in combination with something like a video that we used. I thought, it really had a good impact and actually went a little bit viral, in the office, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so also think about what your handbook and policies are, employee resource groups, diversity and inclusion committee and summit, and then ambassadors at work sites. So, I talked to this, but live training versus generic video, I think gone should be the days of those outdated. I remember looking for, training videos, and they were just terrible. And I think things have gotten better, so I think there are resources out there that are better. But the more personalized you can make it, or having it be internal people doing it, I think will go a long way. Especially people who have recognition in the business, your HR people, etc. And it's when it's coming from people that I think it can have a greater impact. Again, legal definitions versus expectations of a safe, inclusive environment. It's you want to obviously in those environments tell them if anything inappropriate is happening and it's making you uncomfortable, that you report it to your manager, you report it to HR. Yeah, I don't know that with the employees, with the managers, it's more important to talk some about that legal. But with the employees, you can talk about what those concepts are, but really you don't want to have them hone in on that. You don't want them to limit in their minds, oh, well, this isn't that, because I know that's what that legal definition is. You want to focus more on what's appropriate versus inappropriate, what makes them feel safe, what makes them feel included, so that they feel empowered to come forward and not try to have to fit it into some box, which, you're not going to hold that standard anyway. Train your employees on unconscious bias and on microaggressions. They could be subjected to it. They could be people that are, committing, if you will, those microaggressions or saying those microaggressions. And then, provide real world examples and get the employees engaged. And what we did was we had a scale of 1 to 5. And we had, 10 examples of, and one of them was one I said earlier was, here's an example, rate that example. I'm going to go through the 10, rate it 1 to 5. And then afterwards we'll talk about it. And it would be, one example was your coworker tells you that they're gay and you say, oh, you're gay, you don't seem gay. Another example was, oh, you look really hot today. Another example was, we're at a work event, we're at a work happy hour, and someone pinches your behind. Well, how do you rate that? Or someone pinches someone else behind. And then getting a list of those examples, and then having them rate them, and then afterwards explaining, where you would put that rating. And it gives you a good opportunity to talk about these real world examples about what's, inappropriate versus appropriate, and setting the expectation, in the business for what, how people are supposed to act and what you won't tolerate. And we also, I think in that training, it's really important to discuss unacceptable language and just put it out there. Like, I never want to hear, the N word or the C word or, any sort of racial slurs or things of that nature. I also think it's really good to talk about the word gay and the word retarded, because I think that unfortunately, those specifically, are happening even more often. And people say it, in general conversation, and it's very damaging. And, using the word retarded as an insult or, against someone is really can create an environment where people feel uncomfortable and, it's disrespectful. And also I think making sure people understand that even if they're in that group, it's not okay for them to be a perpetrator. Like, if you're of a certain religion, making fun of that religion. If you're gay, making fun of gay people. If you're of a certain race, using a racial slur in the workplace, and holding people to the same standard, and it's not okay for one person versus the other person. So making sure people understand that, even if they fall within that protected class, if they're disabled, making fun of someone who's disabled, it's not okay. And I think, it's really good if you do those examples, if you try to kind of pick, maybe something that's racially based, gender, homophobic, inappropriate touching, able-bodied versus disabled, really kind of get out a lot of those topics so that you have a good range of things to talk about, in that training. All right, and then discuss in-work and out-of-work conduct, company events, happy hours. They need to understand that just because, they are at a work or they're at a happy hour with a bunch of work people, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not the workplace. You don't have to be in the office to potentially create an environment that you would consider workplace or that you could be held accountable for. We used to do a big holiday trip, and it was, a lot of alcohol and a lot of fun. And certainly there were, when you have those kind of environments, and happy hour could be one of them, people are drinking. I'm sure we've all had those meetings the next day after a company event where someone did something wrong and you had to deal with it. So really setting the standard for people that, if you're with people from work, there's no guarantee that that's not considered an extension of the workplace, even if it's not a company-sponsored event. So I think making people understand that, they're going to be potentially held accountable, even if that they're not at a work-sponsored event, and that, look, they can go out and have fun. We're not trying to create an environment where people are, again, robotic, but that they understand that that they need to treat people with respect, whether they're in the office or, in these other environments. I also think it's really important to discuss social media. You should have a social media policy in your handbook that says that, they're responsible for their posts and that they shouldn't use posts to harass, discriminate, or do anything in violation of the EEO policy or your harassment and discrimination policy. Private employees do not have a First Amendment right in their Facebook page, with respect to their employer. Now, do I think that there has to be some distinction between, in work and out of work conduct? Yes. But I think the issue that we have today is, and I've dealt with it many times, in my career, that people have a million friends, right? And they have 100 friends that work with them. And if they are posting things that are, racist, sexist, homophobic, against certain religions, etc., that are offensive, and their person sitting next to them is their Facebook friend in the office, of course that's going to make its way into the office. So I think, and those are tough situations. And I think if you have a situation where you find that in your office and you've come across something, someone brings it to your attention, it is sensitive. You want to try to evaluate and draw the lines. But I think it's important they know, and it's in your policies, that they're responsible for that. And just because it's on Facebook and it's outside of work doesn't mean they can't be held accountable. And then develop a written policy on harassment and discrimination and have employees sign it and re-sign it annually. Include it in your employee handbook. And then conduct refresher training for managers and employees at least annually. Best cases, do things throughout the year that are maybe smaller things that, remind them of their responsibilities. And I'm actually doing an employee handbook seminar. So you could always look at Innovative Benefits Planning's website, but we're doing a whole seminar in Parsippany, New Jersey, KOP, Philly, and Morristown, where I'm located in South Jersey, about the important components of an employee handbook, which I also include, harassment, discrimination, etc. So if it's not in your handbook, it should be, and I recommend also drawing it out of the handbook and having a separate standalone policy that they sign, because often, we see if it's a 50-page handbook, maybe we have it digitally uploaded. It's like a digital copy to your intranet, maybe email digital copy, and then they're signing an acknowledgement. Well, when push comes to shove and if something comes up, I think it's really important that you've gone through that actual policy in your new hire orientation and have them sign off and then have that in their personnel file. So they can't say, well, hey, it was a 50-page handbook, I kind of breezed through it. Not to say they don't have a responsibility to read it, but I just think for employers and HR, it's better to have a standalone policy. All right, and then last but not least, this is actually right on time. Create employee resource groups or ambassadors. And ERGs are, also known as affinity groups or business network groups. But they're groups of employees who join together in their workplace based on shared characteristics or life experiences. And I think this is an important thing for employers to encourage, because it can really create an environment where people feel like they can talk about issues that might not impact everybody. We had ambassadors in a larger company. In my case, we had HR in corporate headquarters, and then we had office managers in each location who did HR, recruiting, and other things. But with we had 9 people in HR at corporate headquarters. But having a designated person in each territory or each office that is someone that they can feel safe and empowered to go to if they have issues, just to talk about like ERGs or the issues that might come up there. We found that was a really good tool. You need to make sure you pick the right people. You need to make sure you train those people. But it's a good way to get people out in the field in a larger company where, HR might not be at their fingertips. So, and then last, I'm sorry, one more slide. Diversity Inclusion Committee and Summit. So again, I mentioned this earlier, but include management and non-management, represent different departments and backgrounds, communicate the existence of the committee to all employees, share updates, and encourage employee questions and feedback. And then we've done a summit, and it's been amazing, an annual gathering to educate employees, discuss the initiatives, and provide an outlet for people to discuss their ideas and concerns. You're not always going to be able to include the whole company. We would pick leaders, up and coming leaders from the different offices, and then have those be the ambassadors who would take that message back to their offices. So without further ado, that concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions. We have about 5 minutes. I'm exactly at 12:55. So I'm happy to answer questions, and if we don't get through all of them, I can answer them in follow-up.
So if you have a question for our speaker, please type it into the question box at this time. Will the slides be available after the presentation?
Yes. Yeah, we can email it to everybody.
Okay, since we have no further questions, I'm going to pass the meeting over to Dana.
Thank you again, Deirdre, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today. Thanks to each of you for joining us on today's webinar. As a reminder, please look for the follow-up email with the link for the survey. Be sure to complete the survey in order to receive HRCI and SHRM credits, and visit www.phillyshrm.org to register for other upcoming events. We encourage you to check out the Philly SHRM website for updates on all of our upcoming programs. On behalf of Philly SHRM, thanks again and enjoy your afternoon.